Hello, everybody. It is Monday, December the 30th, 2024. Only a couple of days left of this unusual year. I guess all years are unusual. Hasn't been a great year, I think, for the globalizers. Yesterday on the show, we had the novelist Joseph O'Neill talking about how to resist what he sees as contemporary fascism. One description of Joseph O'Neill was from my guest today, Simon Kuper. Kuper described O'Neill as a novelist of globalization. And in some ways, I think Kuper himself might be thought of as a journalist of globalization. Of course, in some ways objective, in some ways a supporter of globalization. He's a man of many hats, or a man who wears many hats. And he lives in many places. He's talking to us from Florida in the United States. He was born in Africa, educated in the UK, thought of as a Dutchman, lives now in Paris. Simon, is that a fair description of you as a journalist of globalization or a reflection of globalization?
Both is probably fair, and certainly the people who don't like me would say that. Yeah, I come from everywhere. I'm what Theresa May, the former British Prime Minister, called a citizen of nowhere.
Is that a compliment, though? Citizen of nowhere is a term that was invented by another of our guests over the years, another London-based journalist. Do you wear that with pride, a citizen of nowhere?
I think it's an unfair jibe because it suggests that you're not attached to anything. Whereas I feel attached to more than one place. I feel very attached to Paris. I've become a French citizen in recent years, having lived there more than 20 years. I still, as you hear, I sound British. Grew up in the Netherlands. My parents came from South Africa, which is a place I think we're going to talk about today. So I feel attachments to all those places. It's not that I don't care.
And in fact, I'm not sure if you know, but your father was on the show this year as well, talking about his new book on museums, a man who is more, I guess, South African in some ways than you, a man who grew up in South Africa. Adam, I'll call you Adam. Simon, would it be fair to call 2024 a bad year for globalizers like yourself and O'Neill?
I certainly think that the election of Trump, coupled with the autocracies in China and Russia, and then a Hindu nationalist prime minister in India and the rise of far-right parties in Europe is not very comfortable for people who sort of believe in international cooperation, as I do, who believe that migration is usually a good thing and can be managed in a positive way. I think that the world we're moving to is one where there is no international cooperation. They're just kind of shifting suspicious allies or trying to get what they think is the most for their country and hang everyone else and hang the climate.
Another ex-South African very much in the news is Elon Musk. He's gone to war with the nativists within the Republican Party over these H-1B visas, but he's also in the news because he's backed the German far-right AfD party, and some Germans are very angry, believing that he's trying to exert influence over German elections. Simon, you wrote a really interesting piece a few months ago on Musk, Thiel, and the shadow of apartheid South Africa for the Financial Times. I know you're not an expert on Musk himself. There are lots of authorities, and in fact, we've had Musk biographers on the show before. But I thought you joined the dots in a very provocative way in the, shall we say, the ideological or cultural baggage that people like Elon Musk bring to the table. Explain what you meant by this article.
It struck me as somebody who comes from South African origin and made many visits to apartheid South Africa, visiting my grandparents and other relatives, and I saw how apartheid South Africa works. It struck me that many of the most prominent figures in the MAGA movement are white South Africans in origin or grew up there or had family backgrounds there. So there's Musk, who lived in South Africa until he was about 17. There's his friend Peter Thiel, creator of Palantir, who Musk was in the PayPal mafia with, who spent some of his childhood in South Africa and in Namibia, which was then a state controlled by South Africa, also an apartheid state, where his father worked for an uranium mine. This is when apartheid South Africa was trying to develop a nuclear bomb. There's David Sachs, who has been named by Trump as his AI and crypto czar, who left South Africa with his parents when he was about 5, grew up in the US, but like me, in a South African diaspora family. And more recently come to prominence is Patrick Soon-Shiong, who's originally a Chinese American, came to the US, businessman, investor, invented this massive cancer drug, has become a billionaire, and is the owner of the Los Angeles Times. And he has prevented, famously, the LA Times from attacking Trump. And then I would also name a couple of other people like Joel Pollack, a senior figure at Breitbart, who is of the same kind of Trumpian MAGA persuasion, and a guy nobody's ever heard of, Paul Ferber, who's this obscure South African software developer who has been identified, although he denies it, as the originator of the QAnon conspiracy. Of course, QAnon is a big part of the MAGA movement. So you put it all together and you have all these men, mostly in their 50s, like me, who had these formative experiences in apartheid South Africa, and who are now a very big part of the kind of thinking base of the MAGA movement. And it struck me it's not a coincidence, and I try and argue in this article that some of the mindset of apartheid white South Africa has been transferred to the current MAGA movement.
It's interesting that you described yourself, or you took it as a compliment, although the people meant it. I think Theresa May meant it as an insult to call you a citizen of nowhere. But it's ironic, isn't it, Simon, that men like Musk and Thiel are themselves, in many ways, I take your point on South Africa, and I want to get into that in a few minutes, but they're also citizens of nowhere. Thiel grew up half the time in Germany, then South Africa, then he was educated in the US. There's something astonishingly peripatetic about Musk. He doesn't seem to stay anywhere or live anywhere. Could one argue that globalization has created these very forces of people like Musk and Thiel and Sachs?
Yeah, I mean, we're migrants, and successful, highly educated migrants, and white ones like Musk and Thiel, tend to be accepted quite easily. And even if their documentation isn't fully in order, as it seems Musk's wasn't when he went from South Africa to Canada and then the US, you still tend to be able to get through quite easily because you come in this white male educated package, which tends to allow you to break some rules. And so you have all sorts of migrants. You have the most privileged ones, like them, like me, and then you have the least privileged ones who are not white and who are not rich. And MAGA seems to be kicking down mostly at the unprivileged migrants, but it's led largely by people with very international experiences. Of course, Trump himself, his wife was a migrant to the United States. So there are migrants and migrants. Some are good, some are bad.
So let me rephrase the question. For people like Musk and Thiel, the two ways, I guess, of reading your piece. On the one hand, of course, there's the idea that they're really just trying to recreate the conditions of apartheid South Africa, where blacks were at best second-class citizens, an apartheid system. Another way of reading it is that there's a kind of odd nostalgia on the part of guys like Musk and Thiel for something more certain. So it may not be apartheid they're trying to recreate, but they want to be citizens of somewhere. Which interpretation is fairer, do you think?
I don't think it's quite either. I don't think that they're uncritical supporters of apartheid, something I've always denied. I mean, two women who were at Stanford with Peter Thiel have said that he told them that apartheid worked well economically and that he spoke in support of apartheid, something that he denies. I don't think that they genuinely believe, look, that was brilliant, apartheid, let's do it in the United States. But I think that apartheid South Africa, which they experienced as children, was a kind of extreme cartoon version of the United States today. So some of the themes are very similar. One is this extreme inequality between black and white. I mean, South Africa was about the most unequal place in the world. And liberals like me would say, well, that's because black people were denied any opportunity, were not even allowed to live in areas with business opportunities, were deliberately kept down. And they would say, I think, no, look, it's nature. Some people are equipped for capitalism and others aren't, and it's just tough, and that's the way it is, and it's sentimental to try and help the people at the bottom. The other thing was that in apartheid South Africa, like in the US, but in a much more extreme way in South Africa, you had this fear of a race war. I mean, that underlay everything. I remember very strongly from my times there visiting grandparents and family in the 80s, there was this belief that the only way apartheid could end would be in this tremendously violent war between blacks and whites, which miraculously didn't happen, largely thanks to Nelson Mandela. And so fear of black people, which is a white theme in South Africa and a white theme in the US, would have been very recognizable. And the other thing is, because they were not, I think, supporters of apartheid, they felt this is just a completely screwed up state and government. So both the apartheid government failed to provide, security and wealth and dignity and even electricity to people, to most people. And then the post-apartheid government, the black-led government, also failed to provide all those things. So if you spend time in South Africa, it would tend you towards becoming a libertarian, because libertarians think, well, governments are rubbish, governments fail, governments can't do anything. And South Africa, both during and after apartheid, is a very good example of that. The black governments dealt so badly with AIDS that at one point life expectancy fell to 52 early this century. And so I think they come to America and they think, well, some white people like us are very equipped to succeed in capitalism and black people are not, mostly. And they think governments suck, governments are failures. And the one thing that we need governments to do is to try and protect us in this race war that is coming. And these are, I think, very core themes of Trump's movement, of MAGA. And so I think they helped shape that and they joined that and identified with that. So I think that's where the link between apartheid then and Trump now, I think that's how it works.
Although ironically, of course, Musk himself is involved in much publicized attempts to, so to speak, streamline American government. If there is a core, perhaps the way he thinks, and perhaps also Thiel, it's a kind of libertarianism or hostility to government.
Yeah.
So how do they think of the state simply as a series of institutions designed to protect white people from people of other skins?
That's what the state should be shrunk to, I think, in their view. So you need a police, although better if you have your own kind of private security services, because everything the state does will be bad. The state can't do anything right. So that also, their worldview is, of course, not entirely only shaped by apartheid. They've had many other influences, and one influence is Silicon Valley, which produces these very lucrative products, does it very well, and does so in a country that is dysfunctional in many ways. So they think, look, we are the gods of the private sector, and the stupid people in government, the incompetent people in government should just leave us alone. And so I think Musk's streamlining of government is driven by that kind of impetus. So I think that many of these themes rhyme between South Africa then and Silicon Valley now.
Yeah, so history is repeating itself, perhaps not exactly, but as I think it was Mark Twain who said history rhymes. You brought up this idea of citizens of nowhere. It was a phrase I think that was invented by David Goodhart's. I'm sure you're all too familiar with his work. Goodhart's book, it came out a few years ago now, seemed to be, in some ways, it was quite controversial at the time. I think it's probably less controversial now. Seemed to be a warning to liberals like Joseph O'Neill and perhaps yourself, that most people don't want to be citizens of nowhere. What do you make of Goodhart's thesis? Is there any truth to it?
I think he underestimates the very strong sense of belonging that many people in the elites that he's attacking do have. So, I think David's bête noire is really educated liberal people in cities like London and New York, and many of them are very attached to, let's say, London or New York, and also the place they came from. And then they like going to Italy, say, and learning some Italian. It doesn't make them completely disloyal people who can set up anywhere. So I think that, and often these people are more committed to their communities, if you can call them communities, than the people that David valorizes, who are the working classes who haven't moved, partly because educated people tend to have better lives, and so they're often more contented with their lives, the places they live in, and are very attached to them. So I think he is drawing a false dichotomy between the salt of the earth types who are totally loyal to the place they come from, and then he would dismiss people like me as like a kind of human versions of international capital flows. We could be anywhere, we don't care. I think that's wrong.
The issue of soil, Simon, seems to be central in a kind of ironic way. Musk is, of course, falling back on the idea of soil in his support of the AFD and in his association with the MAGA movement. And yet, as you note, or certainly imply in your piece on the MAGA movement's intellectual foundations in South Africa, South Africa itself was a product of colonization, of white Europeans coming and acquiring the soil. How does the soil play out in this? Why are we back in an age of soil? We thought we'd forgotten that one in the late 20th century, that we'd got beyond it. Why are people falling back, fetishizing the notion of soil, whether it's the AFD in Germany or the MAGA movement in the United States?
Yeah, Musk is an odd person to be championing that, because he's so unattached, not even to anywhere on Earth, but to Earth itself, that he aspires to live
exactly,
in Mars. Yeah. I think that there has been a very big change within the lifetimes of people my age or older, that they remember the streets they grew up in, the country they grew up in as mostly white. And now in many places, it's not, or it's much less white. And so when I go back to the town in the Netherlands where I grew up, and I cycle around, it strikes me. I don't think it's bad at all, but it strikes me that there are many more people who are not white than when I was growing up. And to some people, this is upsetting. They can't say that migration has caused crime, because in fact, homicide rates have dropped across the West in the last 30 years, exactly the period that immigration increased. That's also true in the US. Homicide rates are much lower than in the early 90s when there was less immigration. But it creates a kind of disquiet and unease that is very easy for people like Trump to pick up on, exploit. And Germany, which is now unfortunately Musk's latest target, is exactly a country where a lot of this has happened. So there has been immigration from African countries, a flight of 1 million refugees from places like Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan in 2015. Germany now just doesn't look like the Germany where, as a citizen of nowhere, I studied at the start of the 1990s.
What do you make of the AFD? You wrote an interesting piece for the FT, one of your columns this year, making fairly explicit comparisons between the AFD and the Nazis, at least in terms of where they were getting their support. Do you see the AFD as a neo-Nazi movement?
No, I don't. And I think that term is wrong. What I was doing in that article is I was saying these far-right parties in Europe, whether it's the AfD in Germany, whether it's the Rassemblement National in France, whether it's Meloni's Fratelli d'Italia in Italy, they consist of several strands. And most people who support them are, of course, not fascists or neo-Nazis. There are people who have very negative views on immigration, much more negative than I would want, some of whom are racists, but they don't want to bring back Hitler or Mussolini. But within that party, there's always a strand of people who are often the most hardcore supporters, the most devoted supporters, who do come from often a family tradition of Nazi or fascist support. So if you think of Germany or France or Italy 80 years ago, which is not very long ago in the history of a family, of course, there were many, many people in those countries who were genuine and strong supporters of fascism, who were very upset when the fascists lost the war. And some of them sort of became Christian Democrats or something. And many of them just sulked and told their children that things were much better in the old days. And their children, in some cases, absorbed that message and passed it on. So there are many Germans and French people and Italians, a minority, a small minority, but still many people who do come from those family traditions of hearing that the good guys lost World War II. And when you get parties like the AfD or Fratelli d'Italia popping up, of course, those people are going to attach themselves to that party. They're not a majority within the party at all, but they matter. They're very vocal. They will sometimes say embarrassingly positive things about Hitler or Mussolini that the party leader then has to explain away or apologize for. So when the far-right French Rassemblement National ran hundreds of candidates in the legislative elections this year, 2024, it turned out that many of them had, positive messages about the Nazis on their Facebook pages. So you get those kinds of groups in these parties.
You wrote another interesting column this year on how the media is failing us. I wonder if the media failed us, and I don't quite know who us is, when it comes to describing these so-called radical right-wing parties, the Maloney Party, the National Front in France, Trump, the AfD. Do you think that the media broadly, and I guess it's mostly a liberal media of the Financial Times, the New York Times, the Guardian, even the Wall Street Journal, have they done a good job describing these parties? Is even the term radical right appropriate to describe them?
I mean, scholars of populism argue over terms like far right and radical right, and then you get terms like neo-Nazi, which scholars would very, very sparingly use. I think the issue is that within the media, you'll find very few people who support those parties, which becomes a problem when, as in Europe, they get over 20% of the vote, or as in the US, they get 50% of the vote. And then the supporters of those parties will say, well, the media are biased against us, which is true. But then also, we in the media often say things about those parties that are true but painful to hear. So saying that within these parties there are strands that go back to wartime fascism in Europe is true but painful to hear and sounds very biased. To say that Trump is not a Democrat seems to me obvious, because the core principles of democracy, you would say, are elections, respecting elections, and the rule of law. Trump very explicitly always says that he doesn't necessarily respect election results. He always questions elections, except when he wins. And he attacks the rule of law as this kind of rigged witch hunt against him. So he doesn't respect the rule of law. So, to say that he's not a Democrat seems to me as close as we can get in politics to a statement of fact. But if you say that, then the readers who support him will say, oh, you're just biased and you're hysterical. They point to his first term where he wasn't able to accomplish much. And they say, look, he's just a sensible conservative like me. And I think that one difficulty with this situation is that whatever we in the media say, a large proportion of the population now refuses to believe it. If we say the earth is round, a lot of people will say you must be lying.
It's a tough time, as you've implied, Simon, to be a liberal. You wrote a piece this year in November of this year, last month, Lamentations of a Lost Liberal, which you compare the condition or the situation of liberals today in late 2024 with the situation of Alexander Kerensky. Of course, was famous for his failure in the first Russian Revolution, and he's a footnote now to Bolshevism. Are things that dire for liberals, Simon? Are we all, and I'm as much of a liberal as you are we all card-carrying members of the Alexander Kerensky party, these footnotes to history now?
That's true almost everywhere, in almost all major countries outside Europe. So, the countries that will determine probably the next couple of decades, the US, China, Russia, with its willingness to sacrifice men in wars, which we don't have Iran, Israel now, these are not liberal countries. And they are very aggressive and
So
able.
sorry to jump in here, Simon. Are you grouping the United States with Iran and Russia and China?
They're all different, but none of them are liberal. And they're all willing to project force in ways that in Europe we still have what I would call mostly liberal-led states. So the UK, France, Germany would be described that way. And we just don't matter in the world. I mean, you see it in Syria now. Nobody cares what the Europeans think. We're totally irrelevant to the settlements of Syria. You see it in the war on Gaza. It doesn't really matter what Europeans think. So there are still liberal countries, but they have become very, very largely irrelevant in the world. If you remember 20 years ago, we used to talk about the international community, which meant the US and whichever European countries supported it. It was a ridiculous term then, but it's not even used now.
So, I mean, some people be listening to this and thinking, how can he be grouping? How can Kuper be grouping the United States with China and Russia and Iran? There's still enormous centers of liberal power, culturally, economically, politically, the universities, the Democratic Party. How would you respond to that? Is America? I mean, you, on the one hand, you point to Europe. Is America still have vestiges of liberalism, or is it gone? Is it in the Iran, Russia, China camp now?
No, I mean, America has a much stronger set of liberal institutions, nearly 50% of the population that would subscribe broadly to liberal values. Those people have lost for now. They might well win in future. I would hope so. But they are going to come under huge pressure from the MAGA movement to stop. So you see that particularly with Trump's pressure on Bezos through the Washington Post. Trump is going to favor certain business people and not favor others. And Trump wants you as a business person to submit and to show your personal support for him. So somebody like Jeff Bezos has told the Washington Post to go easy on Trump, and Bezos, I think, has donated to Trump's inauguration. So what Trump can do in his current situation is play favorites and intimidate liberal institutions, intimidate media by suing them for libel, or using federal regulations to disadvantage them, creating difficulties for universities, not allowing visas for their foreign students, their foreign academics. So the federal government, the non-liberal part of the US, has a lot of power to hit those liberal institutions.
The Wall Street Journal, which has an odd newspaper, in some ways liberal, but in many ways conservative, ran a piece last week suggesting, and I'm quoting the title, "The progressive moment in global politics is over." So they are bookmarking this period. Do you agree with the Journal? I mean, is this progressive moment, you sound as pessimistic. I mean, the Wall Street Journal is not necessarily pessimistic. It might be celebrating that end of the progressive moment. But do you agree with them? Are we at the end of a moment or the beginning of a new moment in world history?
I'm not sure what moment they're specifically referring to. I mean, one sort of the great liberal moment in international recent history, I would see as 1989, 1990, when the Soviet Union falls and apartheid falls, and the West really has no counterbalance anymore. And the US and European countries support the creation of democracies in Eastern Europe and South Africa. It's successful. China and Russia, nobody else is around to try and stop that. And so, yeah, that moment is very much gone. You know, I cited Syria. You see now that Syria is in a vacuum. It could be pushed in different directions. You have a new government with very weak control that wants foreign support. Where is it going to get that support? Well, it's not going to be made or broken by Western countries pushing for early elections in Syria and the establishment of democracy in Syria, which would have happened if the Assads had fallen in 1990. Now, I don't think Trump cares about that. The Europeans are in no position to impose that. So, yeah, this is very much not a progressive moment. You have both Israel and Hamas committing what looks very like war crimes. Hamas on October 7th, Israel since. The International Criminal Court has indicted their leaders on war crimes charges, and nothing is done. And you hardly get any Western country that says, this is serious and we think that Benjamin Netanyahu should be arrested and put on trial. The international institutions created by the liberal world don't matter.
So, what should liberals do? In your essay on the lamentations of a lost liberal, you talk about some of your friends, and you're not the first or the last person to be talking about this, who essentially, especially after the Trump election, are just retiring from politics, are focusing on their own things. This is an issue that's come up many times with essayists. George Orwell wrote a wonderful piece about this. Joseph O'Neill believes that there's still a political opportunity. He argues that liberals or progressives need to do everything they can to fight against Trump and Trumpism. What's your take, Simon, on this? What should liberals do? Do they need to reinvent liberalism for the 21st century, for an age in which conservatives have got ahead? I mean, these debates are ongoing. 30 years ago, people said conservatism was dead.
Yeah, I mean, the wheel keeps turning. I mean, Joseph O'Neill is quite right. I quote in my article, I think, Rebecca Solnit, who says something very
similar.
This is not the moment for self-pity. This is the moment to fight. I think that progressives should acknowledge, progressives are very preoccupied, rightly, with discrimination and disadvantage and trying to remove that. And I feel that in the US, they've focused only on the discrimination and the disadvantage based on gender and on color, which are hugely important. And we progressives should fight sexism, we should fight racism. But Trump said, look, there's another kind of discrimination and disadvantage, which is based on class. And so white working class people are also disadvantaged, like black people, like women, in the case of the white working class, by the places where they live, by their clothing, which they get discriminated on, by their cultural habits, by their accents. And they should not be discriminated, and they should be given pride. So that's why MAGA is described often as a white identity movement. And I think, yes, class is as important as race and gender as a form of discrimination that progressives should be alert to. So I see a new progressive movement saying, we are going to fight all those three forms of discrimination, class, race, and gender, and we take them all very seriously. And so we unite the kind of one kernel of, I think, value in the Trump movement with what we have. And then we must look at climate, which I think is barely discussed in politics, but is, I would say, the most important issue of our time. And we have to find a way of selling climate as an absolutely crucial, the most important political issue.
You wrote an interesting piece on Trump, on the great man theory of world politics, whether or not Trump is a great man. Are liberals waiting for a great man? In the US, in the 20th century history of the United States, the great men tended to be progressives, from Teddy Roosevelt to FDR to JFK to Bobby Kennedy. Should liberals, globalizers, be looking for great men or perhaps great women? Or do they need to find new ways of thinking about the world? You mentioned the environment. It's not very new, and it doesn't seem to be much of a vote winner, for better or worse. Do they need to rethink government, networking? Is there something that hasn't been discovered that Democrats or progressives need to focus on if they're to win back not just power, but kind of ideological hegemony?
I mean, first of all, liberals have been good in recent history, often better than conservatives in the US, at finding hugely appealing candidates. So Bill Clinton and Barack Obama left office as admired presidents, which is a very difficult trick to pull off. I think that a lot is language, and one of Trump's strengths is that he speaks in ordinary, recognizable language. I mean, it's an odd similarity between Trump and Orwell, that Orwell believed that simple language was the way to be transparent and to, if you said something that was nonsense, people could see it was nonsense because you were speaking simply. Trump uses simple language to deceive. But I think simple language is incredibly compelling. And Bill Clinton is an example of somebody who mastered that. And the language of the US progressives has become very tortured in recent decades. I think informed by universities that talk about decolonialization, talk about gender, has become very divorced from the way that most of the population speaks. I mean, another very damaging thing that's happening that progressives need to take note of is that reading has hugely declined in the era of the smartphone. And with that, people's vocabularies have hugely declined. And so Trump is much closer. I mean, in the US, you have a third of the population that is at the reading level of a 10-year-old and is just not able to absorb any complex speech, which has its own implications for democracy. Trump has been much better than his Democratic opponents at reaching people who are only able to understand very simple language. I mean, the intellectual regression of the population in most countries in the era of the smartphone is terrifying, but it's something that we need to reckon with politically, as well as something that we need to try to change in society.
Yeah, you seem to be saying two things, Simon. You go back to Orwell and said the importance of simple political language, and then you suggest that most people now have the reading age of 10-year-olds.
No, a third of the US population has the reading age of a 10-year-old.
And I wonder whether Harris and the Harris campaign was a perfect example of misuse or abuse of language, where she talked endlessly, but it was never entirely clear, or not. It was never clear at all what she was trying to say, or whether she was even trying to say something at all.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a political junkie. I follow politics. My sense of the Harris campaign is I see her and she's smiling and laughing and she's dancing, and I'm not quite sure what she's saying. And she was in this bind because Biden had been a very unpopular president and she had been his VP. So it was hard for her to break with him and to suggest that you're a continuation of Biden, which is something she suggested was not going to be a vote winner. So yes, the Democrats chose the wrong candidates in that sense. To have chosen somebody who came from outside, which in American politics always tends to be the best possible start, who can do the kind of Mr. Smith cleaning up Washington act, would have been much more compelling. I mean, Kamala Harris was not a proven vote winner. She had completely failed in her 2020 campaign. I myself would have gone for Pete Buttigieg, who I think is the best speaker among American Democrats, and who also looks like a Midwestern boy. So the Democrats got that horrendously wrong. And it's very hard to feel any sympathy for the Democratic elite, which protected Biden so long, was planning to run him again, and then went for the wrong candidate.
Yeah, and that was another area where the media failed us. I have to admit, this is maybe a subject for another show, I strongly disagree with you on Buttigieg. I think he represents McKinsey speak, which is one way of alienating everyone. But finally, Simon, there's a pessimism, a darkness to what you're saying on both fronts. The rise of the Musk, MAGA, Trump movement, and then the crisis of liberalism. I first came across your work. You've written some wonderful books on football. You started a new podcast, The Human Side of Football, which...
Heroes and Humans.
Sorry, what is it? Heroes and Humans and Football. So going back to humans on the football front or on the football field. What happens to Simon Kuper in this new world? Are you just retiring to football? Are you going back into the whale of football, or are you continuing your political struggle for a better world?
I don't see myself, sadly, as in a political struggle for a better world. I'm more like the orchestra playing as the ship sinks. I'm commenting the demise of my lot, and I find it grimly fascinating. And yeah, I think when I started in journalism, I was always trying not to be a football writer, which I was kept being pushed into, because I wanted to write about important things and why some countries were rich and other countries were poor. I wanted to write about things that mattered. I felt that media mattered. And now I feel we don't matter. Nothing we say changes people's views. Many people, when they find out what they say, they decide the opposite because they hate us. And I also now feel, very unlike 30 years ago, I feel that football in some ways is a higher subject than politics, because the best of football, you see human genius. There is a kind of undeniable quality that you have to show. There is no lying or spin or nonsense. You're good or you're bad. And it gives people joy. And people in football now seem to be less partisan than people in politics. People in football are able to see that somebody on the other team is really, really good. You know, I'm not an Argentinian, but I admire Leo Messi. I think most people in the world admire Leo Messi. People can step beyond partisanship in sports now more than in politics, whereas 30 years ago, it was the opposite.
As a long-suffering Spurs fan, I'm not sure I agree with you on football, but in all seriousness, isn't football another manifestation of the rottenness of globalization? I mean, you mentioned Messi. I know your first podcast was on Mbappe, but hasn't football been taken over by the same dark forces of rotten international capital, the Saudis, the Qataris, the Russians? Isn't football, as in its own way, as in an even more miserable state than politics?
I mean, I've written about mostly the Gulf states taking over the world's best football clubs, replacing the Russians. So Roman Abramovich, who owned Chelsea for about 20 years, was forced out when the Ukraine war, the full invasion of Ukraine, began in 2022. So the Russians are now largely gone. I agree that it's ugly, it's rotten, that a country like Saudi Arabia is sports washing itself through hosting the World Cup in 2034, through owning Newcastle United. But nonetheless, football itself remains a beautiful and pure activity. So the people who are playing for Newcastle, they do their best, they play wonderfully, they're much better than the same teams 30 years ago. And the fans draw a kind of community from it, and community is so rare in the modern world. People, much less than before, go to church, belong to a trade union, know their neighbors. And so football is one of the last remaining sources that many people have of some sense of community and belonging.
Well, Simon Kuper, who's your team, by the way?
I grew up in Holland, so I love Holland, Dutch football, and Ajax more than the other Dutch clubs, but I support any Dutch club playing in Europe is my motto.
Well, Simon Kuper, real honor to have you on the show. You've been brutally honest about the state of liberalism, but we appreciate that brutal honesty on our show. We'll get you back on in 2025. Best for the new year, Simon. Keep well, keep safe, and we'll talk again in the not too distant future. Thank you so much.